As the protectorate governor and the third most powerful figure in the Nazi regime, he never worried that anyone would dare to assassinate him on already subdued territory, so from his villa to the governor's office, he rode in an unprotected open-top car, with no bodyguards at his side except for a single driver. He would arrogantly say that the Czech people would never dare to shoot at him, and on this day, as his car slowed down at a bend, seeing such unprofessional assassins, he was instantly furious, quickly drew his gun, and intended to kill them himself. However, the bomb exploded near the right fender of the open-top car, and it seemed that it had not hit any vital point, as he was still trying to fight back, unaware that fragments from the explosion along with parts of the rear seat had already embedded into his body. Very soon, he lost his ability to fight. He gave up the chase and collapsed weakly onto the back seat, his face twitching. The backrest of the open-top car had already been blasted open with a hole. This man was none other than the core Nazi leader known as the Blonde Beast and the Butcher of Prague, the future successor to Hitler, Heydrich. And the scene before us is the shocking assassination that took place 84 years ago, codenamed Operation Anthropoid. It was one of the most satisfying assassinations of World War II, and also one of the most brutal acts of retaliation in human history. However, this act of righteous resistance came at a tragic cost that humanity could hardly bear. So how did a gun that jammed at a critical moment and a grenade that was thrown end up rewriting the course of World War II? Let us go back to that night 5 months earlier. The time was December 28, 1941, in a forest about 30 kilometers from Prague, where two paratroopers descended from the sky, breaking the silence of the night. They quickly hid their parachuting equipment. One of them appeared to be injured, but they had no time to talk and soon disappeared into the forest. These two were Czech soldiers trained by the British Special Operations Executive, sent back to their homeland to carry out a top-secret assassination mission, codenamed Operation Anthropoid. The injured one was Warrant Officer Joseph, a calm and experienced soldier, who had accidentally cut his right foot on a tree branch during the landing. The other was Sergeant Kubis, a newly trained soldier who had been sent as a replacement. Inside a cave, they needed to treat the injury urgently and then make contact with their liaison as soon as possible. However, at this moment, they did not yet realize that they had landed 30 kilometers away from their intended target, in an unknown location. Several hours later, they were suddenly awakened in a haze by the barking of a hunting dog.
You didn't hide your parachutes very well. You left the blood trail for half a kilometer. Follow me. I live not far from here.
A kind forest ranger brought them back to a wooden cabin and even asked his companion to serve them a bowl of hot soup, which made them suddenly feel the long-lost warmth of their fellow countrymen. Afterward, the ranger promised to drive them to Prague the next day, then turned and walked out of the inner room, closing the door behind him. As a seasoned agent, Joseph felt a strange sense of unease at this unusual behavior. His instincts warned him that they should leave this dangerous place as soon as possible rather than wait idly for more than 20 hours, because such a long period of time was filled with too many uncontrollable variables. And just as he was thinking this through, the corner of his eye caught an unusual expression on the face of the ranger's companion. Joseph decisively pushed open the door, and what he saw was the ranger making a phone call.
Drop the gun.
Kubis chased after him, and although he could have shot the informant, out of compassion for a fellow Czech, he ultimately chose to hold back. But this sudden turn of events made the two of them feel even more strongly how difficult the mission would be, and reality would soon prove that their intuition was brutally accurate. The situation in the occupied territory had already become extremely dire. Under Heydrich's bloody suppression, the Czech people were plunged into deep fear, and their will to resist was on the verge of collapse. More and more people chose to submit. Some even switched sides, and the underground resistance network was almost completely destroyed. All resistance operations suffered from fatal delays and disconnection between command and execution. After that, they drove away in the ranger's truck and headed toward Prague. Along the way, Joseph comforted the pale and shaken Kubis, telling him not to dwell on the ranger's fate, because it was their own choice. They had betrayed their own country, and no one else could bear that responsibility for them. And now, what they needed to do was to quickly make contact with the local resistance and carry out Operation Anthropoid. Kubis nodded slightly, and a trace of determination appeared in his worried eyes. Before long, they drove into the city of Prague, and in the dim and lifeless streets, an atmosphere of terror filled the air. They drove cautiously and followed the address provided by prior intelligence, arriving at an apartment building, but the reality was far from what the intelligence had suggested. they were turned away at the door, and the contact person no longer lived there. At this point, however, their behavior had already made it highly likely that others could guess their identities. So when Kubus tried to seek help, the man directed them to a veterinary clinic. He emphasized that the veterinarian was a good man and that they should be able to get help there. Between the lines, there was clearly something he dared not say outright. Sure enough, when they arrived at the clinic, their identities were recognized at a glance. From their injuries, their accents, and even the handwriting style in their notebook, everything was pointed out one by the veterinarian in front of them. His sharp observation, precise judgment, and attitude toward them made Joseph feel that he must be connected to the underground resistance and was someone they could trust. But the cautious Joseph still chose to express his intentions honestly.
My friend here says that you are a clever man. I agree. Don't do anything that would change our opinion.
With the veterinarian's help, the two prepared to re-establish contact with what remained of the Prague resistance. However, they did not expect that before even meeting properly, they would suddenly be disarmed. It turned out that the entire Prague resistance had already been almost completely dismantled under Heydrich's brutal suppression. The remaining resistance forces had not only lost contact with the government in exile, but more importantly, they had already been infiltrated by the Gestapo. However, once both sides confirmed each other's identities, the resistance leaders Van Eck and Hajski showed great disappointment. They had thought this was the long-awaited reinforcements, but instead discovered that the two men had come for a completely different mission. Even more unexpectedly, when Van Eck learned that Operation Anthropoid was an assassination attempt on Heydrich, the atmosphere of the meeting suddenly spiraled out of control and fell into intense argument.
Are you completely mad?
We have our orders.
But this is madness.
We have our orders, comrade.
Why not have a go at Hitler as well? He's only 300 kilometers down the road in a small village called Berlin.
Van Eck strongly opposed the plan, not only fearing the brutal retaliation from the Nazis, but also angrily accusing the Allies of having once abandoned the Czech people without mercy. Reassuringly, the older Hajski showed rare understanding and tolerance toward the decision of the government in exile. Afterward, Hajski arranged for the two men to stay at the home of Mrs. Moravec, a member of the resistance, and helped them obtain the necessary identification documents for their operations. It was there that they also met two key assistants of Mrs. Moravec. One was her son Ada, a violinist, and the other was Marie, a young and beautiful member of the organization. They were all intelligence operatives who remained within this fractured resistance network. At Joseph's suggestion, and with Marie's introduction, he and her friend Linka each paired up with Kubus and Joseph respectively, pretending to be couples as cover for their outdoor activities. In this way, Joseph and Kubus settled into hiding in Prague and stepped into the new year while waiting, but the new year brought no new hope. Under the shadow of terror, Prague remained as silent as death, until one day, Van Eck delivered weapons and ammunition to them, a $9 Sten submachine gun, 100 rounds of bullets, and 3 anti-tank grenades. Although crude, it was already the best that the underground resistance could provide. At the same time, their comrade who had been separated during the drop also found the organization, which helped the resistance, on the verge of collapse, re-establish contact with the government in exile. Soon after, they organized a full meeting. To avoid suspicion, the meeting was secretly held in a busy cafe. Marie and Linka were responsible for keeping watch outside.
You sit here, order a drink.
At the meeting, they focused on discussing 3 possible plans. The first was to carry out the assassination at Heydrich's villa or the governor's office. The second was to cause a train derailment while he was traveling back to Berlin for a report, killing him in the process. The third was to strike while he was traveling from his villa to the governor's office. Considering that the first 2 plans involved heavily guarded locations, making them extremely difficult and high risk, they were ultimately abandoned, and the assassination was instead set to take place in Prague during his commute. However, to execute this plan, they not only needed to accurately determine the timing and route of his movements, but more importantly, they had to prepare 2 separate assassination strategies to account for whether or not he would be escorted by an armored vehicle, as this was a random variable, and they had to identify the pattern precisely. For this reason, Joseph decided that he and Kubus would personally carry out this task, and just after everyone reached a consensus on the plan, Hajski made a serious request to all of them.
This operation will involve almost everyone we have left in the resistance. If you are arrested, you will face some harsh facts. There will be no escape. You will be tortured until you reveal everything you know. You must protect your fellow comrades by shutting down any links you have to them.
Those pills laid out before them, everyone knew exactly what they meant. Yet every single person resolutely chose to face death. But just as the meeting was in full discussion, an accident suddenly occurred. Kurta's carelessness drew the attention of the SS outside. And through the gap, they saw a military policeman walking toward them, but what no one expected was that this impending disaster was forcefully stopped by Marie and Karen, who were on lookout duty. As they displayed remarkable courage and quick thinking, after that, Joseph and Kubus devoted all their energy to studying Heydrich's travel route, what time he left, what time he returned, and what time he passed each section of the road. All of it was carefully recorded. The most difficult part, however, was still the inability to determine the pattern of the armored escort. For this reason, they could only adopt a primitive method, which was to wait patiently for the moment when there was no armored escort and strike then. In addition, they collected a large amount of real-time traffic information along the route and ultimately chose to act at a steep downhill curve along his regular path, because at that point, the vehicle's speed would not exceed 10 miles per hour, making it the slowest section of the entire journey. In this way, after all preparations were completed, nearly 5 months had passed without them even realizing it. But just as the plan was about to be put into action, another accident occurred. Van Eck, the resistance leader who had previously seemed cooperative, once again raised strong opposition.
I cannot give the go-ahead without asking London to reconsider.
Ladislav, this is a military operation. It's not your order to
Without
leave.
the resistance, this mission doesn't exist.
I am with Ladislav. We should get London to rethink our position here.
What should have been a mobilization meeting fell into an unsolvable deadlock. The opposing side, including Van Eck and Kurta, insisted on waiting for a reply from London before making any decision. Joseph had no way to resolve this, even though he had gained the support of Van Eck's companion Hajski. And so, time passed little by little as they waited in silence. That day was the birthday of Mrs. Moravec's son Ada, and it was also a rare moment of relaxation for everyone. At that moment, all conversations seemed to deliberately avoid the troubling subject of their mission. Then Kubus suddenly announced surprising news in front of everyone. He said that he had proposed to Marie, and that she had accepted his proposal. That night, Joseph gave his comrade his heartfelt blessings. At that moment, he deeply understood that in a time torn by war, the small spark of love that grew amid life and death was incredibly precious. It was enough to warm their suppressed hearts, because he held the same feelings for Lenka, yet he could not express them. A few days later, Joseph finally received a coded message from headquarters stating that the mission must continue and was of critical importance. Such a message was equivalent to a direct order, and Joseph could act at any moment. And just at that time, accompanied by urgent knocking, Hajski and Van Eck rushed in and delivered a piece of news that left Joseph breathless.
One of our contacts inside the castle has seen correspondence ordering Heydrich back to Berlin. And there have been conversations in the household about a new posting to Paris. It means that once he goes to Berlin, he may not be back.
Joseph had no choice, and his immediate reaction was that the operation had to be carried out at once.
We do it tomorrow.
However, to everyone's surprise, a single remark from Van Eck reignited the conflict completely.
They agreed with my request to stand down the mission. Let Yindra Group know.
No. I've just decoded a message from London. Proceed. Utmost importance.
But this clearly states you must stand down.
You are deluded. This is for Yindra.
I agree with Joseph. I believe its purpose is to calm the nerves in Yindra.
At the critical moment, Hajski once again stood firmly on Joseph's side. At this point, Van Eck could only leave in silence. Later that night, Kubus, as a new soldier, suffered an acute stress reaction under immense pressure.
As we were told. Concentrate on the detail.
The next morning, the two men quietly said goodbye to Mrs. Moravec. Before leaving, Kubus gave the wooden puppet he had carved to Ada as a keepsake, but as soon as they stepped outside, they saw Lenka walking toward them anxiously. She had already learned that today was the day of the operation, and possibly the day they would face death. During their short time together, Lenka had already been deeply moved by this man who was willing to sacrifice himself for his country. At the moment of parting, Lenka gave him a deep and passionate kiss, because she knew that he might never return. At 8:20 in the morning, the members of the operation were in position and began setting up an ambush at the chosen curve. Joseph once again clarified everyone's tasks and how they would coordinate with each other. Valsik was responsible for signaling from a distance whether there was an armored escort. Apaka was responsible for slowing down the convoy within effective range. Kubis was tasked with attacking from behind the vehicle, while Joseph himself would act as the primary shooter to carry out the assassination. In this way, a carefully planned assassination was about to unfold. Everything was ready except for the final moment. However, as time passed second by second, the target did not appear. At 9:20, the time when the vehicle would normally pass, everyone waited in torment as each second dragged on. The nervous Kubis kept reminding himself to stay calm. At 10:30, Joseph finally saw the signal from Valsik in the distance. The target had appeared and there was no armored escort. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and Hadric was destined to pay for his arrogance. However, at the very moment of pulling the bolt and loading the weapon, fate played its cruelest joke. The gun jammed. At that moment, Kubis completed his transformation into a true warrior driven by courage, and it was the grenade he threw at that critical moment that ended the life of the infamous Butcher of Prague and saved his comrade Joseph. But as Joseph tried to escape, what he saw was Hadric's desperate counterattack, which made him believe that Operation Anthropoid had failed. The citywide curfew that followed plunged Prague into even greater terror and bloodshed. At the same time, the news of Lenka's death drove Joseph into despair and deep self-blame, but the most urgent problem before them was finding a place to hide. In the end, with the help of Mrs. Moravec, they were temporarily arranged to stay in the Church of Father Petrek, where they joined other members already hiding in the basement, waiting for a chance to relocate. There were 5 resistance members who had recently parachuted in and gathered there. After that, they made necessary arrangements and divided their duties. 3 stayed above ground on guard, while the others remained hidden below, rotating shifts at regular intervals. At the same time, the Nazis cast a massive dragnet across the entire city and offered a reward of 10 million crowns for the capture of the assassins. Anyone who failed to report information would be executed on the spot along with their families. A few days later, Father Petrek brought them 2 shocking pieces of news.
Reinhard Heydrich has died in hospital, a direct result of the injuries sustained in the attack.
Yesterday, the Germans went to a village of Lidice and shot every man over the age of 16. The women and children have been taken to camps.
The entire Prague was engulfed in the Nazis' endless and brutal retaliation, and they had given a 5-day deadline. If the assassins were not handed over, 30,000 Czech civilians would be executed. Hearing this devastating news, Kubis was filled with anguish and decided to surrender himself in order to stop the massacre, but his naive idea was immediately rejected by everyone. At the same time, another terrifying event occurred, one that would directly endanger the lives of all underground resistance members. Kurda, a member of the resistance, succumbed to Nazi threats and temptation, and out of fear for his life, betrayed them.
You say you know the man who assassinated Reichsprotector Reinhard Heydrich, but you didn't take part in it.
Mrs. Moravec and her family became the first victims of this betrayal.
Los! Wo sind die Fallschirmspringer?
I know nothing. You must be confusing us with other Moravets.
Knowing she could not escape her fate, Mrs. Moravec used the excuse of going to the bathroom and took poison to end her life. But the brutal Nazis did not stop. They smashed Ada's hands with a hammer and killed his mother in a horrific manner. Unable to endure the overwhelming fear and pain, Ada was completely broken and in a daze revealed Joseph's hiding place. Meanwhile, because the Archbishop opposed continuing to shelter resistance members, Father Petrek planned to smuggle them out of the city using a funeral cart. However, it was already too late, as the SS, having learned the location, had completely surrounded the church. The date was June 18, 1942. 7 men against hundreds of German soldiers. A battle with no chance of victory was about to begin. The German forces launched wave after wave of attacks, but Kubis and 2 other resistance members guarding above ground fought with everything they had, preventing the SS from advancing. Before long, the impatient Germans deployed heavy machine guns and grenades, unleashing devastating firepower. Bricks flew through the air and bullet holes covered the walls like a hive. After several hours, 2 comrades fell one after another, and Kubis, severely wounded, took his own life, honoring his final promise to his country. Immediately after, the Germans launched almost frenzied unconventional attacks against those hiding in the basement, flooding the area with water and using explosives. But Joseph and the remaining 3 refused to surrender. As the water level rose to their bodies, they each chose to end their own lives. All 7 resistance members hiding in the church were killed. Not long after, Father Petrek was also executed by the Nazis. In the end, Operation Anthropoid achieved success at the cost of the most tragic sacrifice. But it did not bring cheers of victory, only a heavy and solemn silence, and the price of that sacrifice was the life of the Nazi figure Heydrich. A jammed submachine gun worth $9 changed the course of World War II, because the successful assassination of Heydrich was not only a decisive elimination of a key figure, but also had profound strategic, political, and moral impact. After Heydrich's death, Hitler never found another person capable of efficiently integrating resources in the occupied territories. His death accelerated the collapse of Germany.